March 6th, 1970. 9:18 p.m., Tallapoosa County, Alabama. A black man in a midnight blue suit stepped through the warped doorway of an old cotton warehouse and walked straight into a circle of 12 men wearing white hoods. They laughed because they thought he'd come to beg. Frank Lucas didn't beg. He set a gold watch on a splintered table and gave them 10 minutes to sign away the building they believed belonged to them. And the reason the room went silent wasn't mercy. It was the moment they realized the only thing keeping them safe had already been removed. The warehouse sat off County Road 88, 3 miles outside Alexander City, behind a closed-down feed store and a line of pine trees that did a poor job of hiding headlights. The sign out front still read Barnett Storage in peeling red letters, like the place had once stored furniture and farm tools instead of secrets. On warm nights, you could smell river mud from the Tallapoosa, oil from the highway, and old cotton dust trapped in the walls. The locals called it the barn because in Alabama, you called anything big and empty a barn. Frank didn't call it anything. In later interviews, years later, when men tried to reshape their fear into folklore, people said the first thing they noticed was how clean he looked. Not rich, clean. The cuffs were sharp. The shoes were polished. The hair was neat. He didn't walk like a man arriving at a meeting. He walked like a man arriving at property he already owned. Outside, his car, an unremarkable dark sedan with out-of-state plates, sat under a dying street lamp that barely worked. No entouraje, no convoy, no show. If you passed by on the road, you would have assumed it was a lost salesman or a man waiting for a friend. Inside, the men were arranged like a ritual. A folding chair here, a stack of crates there, a cheap card table in the center with beer bottles, a coffee can full of cigarette butts, and a shotgun laid flat like decoration. A battery-powered radio sat near the table, low volume, static at the edge of a local country station. The Klansmen had planned the scene. They wanted the room to feel like a trap before anyone even spoke. Their leader was named Grady Henson, Grady to his friends, Mr. Henson to men who owed him. Heavy-set, thick-necked, with hands that looked like they'd been built for wrenching bolts and breaking noses. He wasn't the smartest in the room, but he didn't need to be. In that county, fear was a currency, and Grady had been minting it for years. He stepped forward, holding a coil of rope like a prop. "Boy," he said, voice loud enough to bounce off the sheet metal walls. "You lost?" The circle laughed. A few of them slapped their thighs. One of them made a sound like a farm animal. Somebody coughed and spit. "This ain't Harlem," Grady added. "Out here we make the rules." Frank Lucas looked at the rope, then at Grady's boots, then at the shotgun on the table like he was inventorying his store. His face didn't change. His eyes didn't dart. There was no nervous energy. He wasn't pretending to be calm. He was calm. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a gold watch. A heavy one. The kind of watch you didn't wear to tell time. The kind you wore to tell people you could buy time. He set it on the table, right next to the beer bottles and the cigarette butts, like he was placing something sacred among trash. Then he looked at the minute hand. "You got 10 minutes, Frank said. Not loud, not soft, certain, to sign." The room laughed harder, because laughter is what men do when they can't decide whether to be angry or afraid. Grady moved closer, rope dangling, enjoying himself. "Sign what?" Grady asked. Frank didn't answer immediately. He unlatched a thin leather portfolio he'd carried in like it was nothing. Inside were papers, clean and crisp, not folded. A deed transfer, a lease termination, a sales agreement, names typed neatly. A company name that meant nothing to anyone in that room. Southern Storage and Logistics Incorporated. Frank slid the papers across the table and placed a pen on top like a judge placing a sentence. "The warehouse," Frank said. "Tonight." Grady stared at the documents like they were written in another language. Then he threw his head back and laughed. Big, theatrical laughter meant for the 12 men behind him. "This here is our place," Grady said. "You don't own a nail in this building." Frank looked at his watch again. "I didn't come to argue about what you think," he said. I came to tell you what's about to happen. One of the men on the left, tall, skinny, impatient, took a step forward and angled his shotgun upward, not directly at Frank, but close enough to make the message clear. His hood was slightly crooked, and his hands shook in a way that betrayed his mouth. He wanted to be the first to do something. Frank didn't look at the shotgun. He looked at the man's shoes. You know what's funny? Frank said, "Y'all got all that costume on, and I can still see who you are." That line hit differently. The laughter thinned out. A couple of men shifted their weight. Grady's smile tightened. "You got nerve," Grady said. "Or you got stupid." Frank shrugged once, small. "I got a schedule." Somewhere in the warehouse, a board creaked. Not from Frank. From someone moving in the shadows behind the circle. Grady turned his head slightly, checking his men without looking like he was checking. That's what leaders do when they're used to control. They monitor the room like a farmer monitors animals. "You walked in here alone," Grady said. "Like you think you somebody." Frank nodded once. "I walked in alone," he said, "because I didn't need y'all looking at my people. I needed y'all looking at me." Grady stepped closer until they were inside each other's space. The rope hung between them like a noose that hadn't chosen a neck yet. "You threatening us?" Grady asked. Frank finally looked him in the face. His expression was almost bored. "I'm giving you options," Frank said. "You sign, you keep breathing, and you keep your little church meetings." He tapped the papers with one finger. "You don't sign, and you're going to leave this county one of two ways. Quiet or boxed." That made the room explode again. Laughter, insults, animal sounds. The tall, skinny one with the shotgun took another step like he might close the distance with violence. "Boxed," somebody repeated, mocking. "Listen to this, boxed." Frank checked the watch. The second hand moved. It was the only thing in the room that moved smoothly. At 9:21 p.m., 3 minutes had passed. Grady leaned in and lowered his voice, trying on something that sounded like a threat. "You don't understand where you at," Grady said. "I can call the sheriff. I can call the boys down at the station. I can make you disappear in these woods." Frank's gaze didn't change. "You can call whoever you want," Frank said. "But you're going to notice something in a minute." Grady smiled like he'd caught him. "And what's that?" Frank tilted his head, like he was listening to the building itself. "That they're not coming." A beat, then another beat, and then, from somewhere outside, faint, so faint most people would miss it, came the sound of a car door shutting. Not a slam, a controlled close. The tall, skinny man with a shotgun turned his hooded head toward the warehouse door. Grady noticed. He didn't like that. Leaders hate when their men look away. "You got friends out there?" Grady asked, trying to sound amused. Frank didn't answer the question. He looked at his watch. At 9:23 p.m., 5 minutes remained. One of the Klansmen, older than the others, voice rough like he'd smoked since childhood, spoke from the back. "This is a trick," the older man said. "He wants us to jump him so his boys can come and shoot us." Frank finally smiled just a little. Not warmth. Calculation. "If I wanted you dead," Frank said, "you wouldn't be discussing it." The words landed like cold metal. Grady's face hardened. The rope in his hand tightened unconsciously. "Enough," Grady snapped. "Get him." The tall, skinny one raised the shotgun and stepped in. It was the moment the room expected Frank to flinch. A blink, a recoil, something human. Frank didn't move. The man hesitated, confused by the absence of fear. That hesitation wasn't moral. It was instinct, like a dog sensing a trap. Frank spoke quietly, like he didn't care about the gun. "You see that watch?" he asked. "That ain't for show." Grady barked a laugh that sounded forced now. "What is it for then?" Grady asked. Frank nodded toward the radio on the table. "Listen," he said. For a half second, nobody did. Then the radio crackled. Not the country station. Not music. A burst of static. A voice. Male. Low. Close enough to sound like it was in the room. "Copy outside's clear." Several heads snapped toward it. The tall, skinny man's shotgun dipped by accident. Grady frowned and leaned toward the radio like he wanted to pretend he hadn't heard it. "What the hell is that?" someone muttered. Frank kept his eyes on Grady. That, Frank said, is why you got 10 minutes. Grady's posture shifted. He didn't like uncertainty. He was a man built for simple math. Intimidation equals compliance. This was different math. You got somebody on my property? Grady demanded. Frank glanced at his watch again. You worried about property now? He asked, almost amused. Sign the papers. Then we can talk about whose property it is. At 9:25 p.m., 3 minutes remained. That's when the lights went out. Not a dramatic explosion, not sparks and fire, just sudden darkness, like the building had been unplugged from reality. A few men cursed. Boots scraped the floor. Someone knocked over a beer bottle. Glass skittered across concrete. Grady's voice rose, sharp. Lights, he shouted. Get the... The radio crackled again, closer, clearer. Generators off. Grady froze for half a second. The circle wasn't a circle anymore. It was a bunch of men trying to find the edges of their courage in the dark. Then from outside, another sound, the unmistakable thud of something heavy hitting wood. A door. A body. Something. No one could see. That was the point. The tall, skinny man lifted his shotgun again. But in the dark, it was useless unless you wanted to shoot your own people. White hoods became blindfolds. The thing they wore to look powerful now made them clumsy, panicked, trapped. Frank's voice remained steady in the darkness. 6 minutes ago, he said, you was laughing? Grady tried to sound in control. Don't you talk, Grady snapped, but his voice carried a tremor now. You ain't. Frank cut him off, calm. I'm standing in the same place, he said. You want me? Come get me. No one moved. That was the real shift. Not darkness. Not the radio. The fact that none of them moved. At 9:26 p.m., 2 minutes remained. A faint hiss slid through the warehouse like a snake sound. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a thin, irritating intrusion that made men cough and wipe at their faces. What is someone choked? Coughing spread fast, contagious as fear. A few men stumbled toward where they thought the door was. They slammed into crates. One fell and swore. The older one started yelling orders that no one could follow. Grady coughed once, hard, then tried to speak anyway. You think you smart? He rasped. You think you. Frank's footsteps moved, slow, deliberate. Not running. Not hunting. Approaching. Grady backed up instinctively and bumped into the table. The paper slid. The pen rolled and dropped to the floor. Frank stopped close enough that Grady could hear him through the coughs and the chaos. You set this up like a show, Frank said. The circle, the rope, the gun on the table. You wanted me to feel small. Grady's breathing was louder now. He tried to lift the shotgun, but he couldn't find it in the mess. The hood was a curse. Frank spoke like he was delivering terms at a bank. You don't understand, he said. I didn't come here to talk about pride. I came here to talk about logistics. That word didn't belong in that warehouse. Logistics. It sounded like a man in an office, not a man in a Klan meeting. And that's exactly why it was terrifying. Because Frank wasn't emotional. He wasn't here for a fight. He was here for a system. At 9:27 p.m., 1 minute remained. A small beam of light appeared, thin, controlled, sweeping the floor. Not a flashlight waved around in panic. A narrow, deliberate beam, like someone who knew what they were looking at. It fell on the papers. The deed transfer. The company name. The line where Grady needed to sign. Frank's voice stayed low. Your people outside? He asked Grady. They're not answering, are they? Grady coughed again, then spat. He didn't answer. Frank let the silence do the work. Sheriff, Frank continued, you think he's yours. He's a man with bills. He's a man with a daughter who wants to go to Auburn. He's a man who likes cash in envelopes. Frank paused. He ain't loyal. He's rented. Grady's throat made a wet sound. Panic began to eclipse hatred. You don't know nothing about. Grady tried. Frank's beam of light slid upward, stopping on Grady's chest, like a gun sight without the gun. I know your bank, Frank said. I know the loan you took out on your wife's name. I know the night you drove to Montgomery to meet a man you don't talk about in public. He took a breath. And I know you don't own this building the way you think you do. That line cut through the coughing. Even the men who hated Frank stopped making noise to listen, because curiosity is stronger than ideology when survival is on the line. Grady's voice dropped, raw. What do you want? Frank answered immediately. You sign the papers, he said, and you give me the keys. Grady hesitated. Hesitation is a kind of prayer. Then the radio crackled again, almost casual. Time. Frank looked at his watch, even though he didn't need to. The ritual mattered. The watch wasn't about time. It was about dominance. 10 minutes, Frank said softly. I keep my word. The beam of light landed back on the paper. The pen, somehow, had been placed beside it again. Not magic, not mystery, just control. Grady's hand shook. He reached for the pen. He looked around for help and found only silhouettes of men coughing inside the costumes that made them feel brave. He bent over the paper. And then, mid-signature, he stopped because he realized something. Something worse than losing a warehouse. If he signed, he would be submitting to a black man in front of his own men. In Grady's world, that was death, even if he kept breathing. He lifted his head, anger flashing through fear. You ain't walking out of here, Grady said. Not after this. Frank didn't react like a man threatened. He reacted like a man correcting a misunderstanding. Oh, he said, I'm walking out. Grady tried to rise. Frank's voice sharpened, not with volume, but with finality. Sit, he said. One word. And Grady sat, because the room had already decided who held power. The hatred didn't disappear. It just got caged by fear. Grady signed. The moment the ink touched the last line, the warehouse got quieter. The coughing eased as the hissing stopped. The beam of light held steady. The circle, what was left of it, stood frozen like witnesses at an execution that didn't require blood. Frank picked up the papers carefully, like they mattered more than the men who'd tried to humiliate him. He slid them back into the leather portfolio. Then he did something that confused them. He didn't gloat. He didn't preach. He didn't threaten them with a long speech about justice. He simply said, good. That good was colder than any insult. At 9:29 p.m., the lights flickered back on. Not fully, just enough to reveal the scene. Men in wrinkled hoods, eyes red, breathing hard. The table shifted, beer spilled, the shotgun on the floor. Grady seated, pen still in hand like he didn't remember picking it up. Frank stood clean in the center of the mess, suit untouched. And now, with the lights back, they could see another detail. Frank wasn't alone. Not inside, not with the crowd, but with presence. At the far end of the warehouse, near the loading bay, a door stood open that had been closed before. In the doorway, barely visible, were two men without hoods. Dark jackets, calm posture, not moving forward, not showing weapons. Just there like punctuation. They didn't need to do anything. They didn't need to say anything. They existed to confirm what Frank had been saying all along. You're late to understanding the situation. Grady stared at them, then back at Frank. Frank looked at his watch one more time, as if completing a ritual. 10 minutes, he said. He closed the watch's clasp with a soft click and slipped it back into his pocket. The men expected him to walk out then, like the scene was over. Frank wasn't done. He stepped closer to Grady, close enough that Grady could smell Frank's cologne, expensive, deliberate, out of place in that building. You laughed because you saw my skin, Frank said, voice low enough that only the closest men could hear. That's what you've been taught to do. Grady's jaw flexed. Rage wanted to rise again, but it met the wall of what had just happened. Frank continued, measured. I looked at you, he said, and I didn't see a hood. I saw a problem, a blockage, something in my way. He tapped the portfolio lightly, like it contained the blueprint of a machine. I don't hate you, Frank said. I don't got time to hate you. That was the midpoint twist, whether anyone in that room understood it or not. They wanted it to be personal. They needed it to be personal because personal hatred was something they could fight with pride. Frank made it business. Business is harder to fight. Grady swallowed. His voice came out hoarse. So what now, he asked. Frank turned slightly, letting his eyes sweep across the 12 men. Now, he said, you work. That made them murmur, confused, insulted. Frank raised a hand, small motion, and the murmurs died. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. You think this is about me taking a building, Frank said. It's not. He leaned in toward Grady. This county got roads, Frank said. Quiet roads. Roads that don't get checked. Roads that go where I need them to go. Grady's eyes narrowed, suspicion fighting fear. You want us to? Frank cut him off. I want you to do what you already do, he said. I want you to be seen. The room didn't understand at first. Frank spelled it out without explaining too much. He never explained too much. You got a reputation, he said. People move when you show up. People look away when you tell them. You're loud on purpose. You burn crosses and drive slow down a street, so everybody knows you there. The men shifted uncomfortably. Being described so clinically stripped their theatrics of meaning. It made their violence sound like a tool, not an ideology. Frank's tone stayed flat. I'm moving things through this county, he said. Things nobody needs to understand. If I send my people, folks ask questions. If you show up, folks don't ask questions. Folks get out the way. Grady stared at him like he'd just been offered a deal with the devil. You crazy, Grady whispered. Frank's eyes didn't blink. No, he said. I am practical. A brief quiet fell. Even the radio seemed to hush. Then Frank gave them the condition that turned their submission into humiliation. Starting tonight, he said, you don't touch black businesses in this county without my say. One of the men in the back barked a laugh, trying to recover his dignity. You ain't the... Frank snapped his eyes toward him, and the laughter died mid-breath. I am, Frank said simply. Grady's mouth opened, then closed. He knew what that meant. It wasn't protection out of kindness. It was protection out of ownership. Frank wasn't saving people. He was securing territory. Frank continued calm. You got a problem with that, he said. You can bring it to me. In Harlem. In daylight. On my block. That was the kind of sentence that sounded like a dare wrapped in civility. It was also a test. Frank knew none of them would come. The tall, skinny one with the shotgun, eyes wet from coughing, tried to speak, voice shaking with delayed bravado. This ain't over, he muttered. Frank looked at him like he was looking at a broken appliance. It's over, Frank said. You just don't know it yet. Grady's voice came out smaller than it had been all night. What do you need? He asked. Frank opened the portfolio again, pulled out another sheet, shorter this time. Not a deed, a schedule, times, routes, a list of license plate numbers. Nothing that looked illegal on its face. Nothing that would mean anything to someone not inside the machine. You got trucks, Frank said. You got drivers who don't mind keeping their mouths shut. You got men who will stand on a corner with a cigarette and watch a road because you told them to. He slid the sheet to Grady. You're going to assign 2 of your boys, Frank said, to be at this warehouse every Tuesday and Friday night. Midnight to 4. One of the men scoffed. We ain't your. Frank didn't even glance at him. Grady, staring at the paper, looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. And if we don't? Grady asked. Frank's answer came easy. Then you're going to learn what it feels like when every man you've been paying off stops answering your calls, Frank said. You're going to learn what it feels like when your bank gets curious, when your wife gets served papers, when your friends start pretending they don't know you. He let that hang for a second. I ain't got to hurt you, Frank said. I can erase you. That sentence was the real gun in the room. Grady's hand hovered over the paper like it was hot. He looked around at his men. None of them offered him courage. They'd come here for certainty and found something worse. A man who didn't need their hatred to defeat them. Grady nodded once, almost imperceptibly. All right, he said. Frank watched him, expression unreadable. Say it like you mean it, Frank said. Grady swallowed, humiliation thick. All right, he repeated louder. We'll do it. Frank closed the portfolio and tucked it under his arm. Then he did something that stung more than threats. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Plain, white, the kind you put rent money in. He placed it on the table. That's for the broken bottle, Frank said. And the mess. The men stared at the envelope like it was a joke. Grady's voice cracked. You paying us? He asked, offended by the implication. Frank shook his head once. I'm paying for what I used, he said. I pay my debts. He looked at Grady, eyes calm, and added the line that made the room colder. You should try it. Frank turned toward the door. One of the men, young, jittery, pride wounded, made a move. Not a full attack, just a step, a twitch, like his body wanted to reclaim the script of the night. One of the two men in the doorway shifted his weight slightly, and the young man stopped. No weapon was raised. No violence was shown. But the message was unmistakable. Don't. Frank walked out at 9:33 p.m., alone in the way that mattered. Outside, the Alabama night was quiet in the unnatural way it gets when the world is holding its breath. The dark sedan waited under the street lamp. The pine trees swayed like they'd seen this county's secrets for 100 years and would see 100 more. Frank paused at the threshold and looked back once. Grady sat at the table, hood half off now, face exposed, eyes angry and afraid and ashamed all at the same time. The 12 men stood scattered, no longer a circle, no longer a unit. The shotgun lay untouched, like a prop from a play that had ended early. Frank didn't smile. He delivered one last sentence, quiet and surgical. I came in alone, he said, because I didn't need you to see my people. He let the words settle. I needed you to understand you never had the power you were pretending to have. Then he left. The door shut with a simple sound, meeting wood like a file closing. In the weeks that followed, the story changed depending on who told it. Some swore Frank had walked in with a gun. Others swore he never carried one. Some claimed there were bodies outside. Others claimed there weren't. Fear makes people invent details because details make fear feel organized. But certain facts stayed consistent. The deed to Barnett Storage transferred to a company no one in Tallapoosa County had heard of. The tax records changed. The keys changed hands. Trucks began arriving on Tuesday and Friday nights. Always on time, always quiet, always unloaded fast. And the Klan men who once drove through black neighborhoods slow, smiling, burning crosses for sport, stopped doing it. Not because they'd found morality, because they'd found a new owner. A bartender in Alexander City later told a reporter that Grady started drinking alone after that night. Not loud drinking, quiet drinking. The kind where a man stares at his glass like he's trying to remember when he stopped being the one in control. A deputy at the sheriff's office, one who would never speak on record, said the sheriff received an envelope one morning with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of the feed store behind the warehouse. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were 3 words, "Don't be late." After that, the sheriff stopped answering Grady's calls. And that's the part that made the story spread the fastest, because in counties like that, power is measured in who picks up the phone. A few months later, a rumor made its way through the same circles that had laughed at Frank, that a federal task force had been sniffing around the county roads, that there were questions, that there were whispers about trucks, schedules, and something moving through Alabama that didn't belong there. Grady's men started meeting less. The warehouse meetings stopped. The white hoods disappeared into closets, and the men who wore them tried to pretend they were just regular citizens again. But once a man has been broken quietly, he never truly becomes regular again. He becomes careful. The coldest version of the ending came from a line in a courthouse hallway years later, when a lawyer, defending someone who claimed he'd once been somebody in that county, leaned close and said, almost admiringly, "You can't fight a man who don't hate you. You can't bait him. You can't scare him. He ain't playing your game." Because that was the truth buried inside the myth. That night in the warehouse wasn't a brawl. It wasn't revenge. It was a takeover performed with a watch, a pen, and the kind of calm that turns men in masks into men in hiding. And the last fact, the one no one ever laughed at, was this. On the morning of March 7th, 1970, the county records office stamped a deed transfer at 10:12 a.m. The clerk didn't know the name Frank Lucas. The clerk didn't know why the warehouse mattered. The clerk just pressed ink on a paper and moved on with her day. But in Tallapoosa County, after that stamp, 12 men who used to laugh at the idea of fear started living inside it.